This is biochemistry, or what we call integrative medical biochemistry. And this is kind of review session for you. All the slides you're going to see, you already seen it before. We just put it together in one context, and that is anabolism. And we're going to focus on key molecule, and this is NADPH. And you would ask, what do we have to do with NADPH and musculoskeletal block? Well, first of all, as I indicated, it is review session for you. For biochemistry students ask because, to get these kind of review sessions because they said that by the time they graduate or you take your USMLE, we forgot all about biochemistry. 1. 2, we're talking about muscles, talking about main organ, basically. And here's my question to you. You're sitting right now. What are your muscles utilizing for energy?
Fat and rest and exercise and glucose.
What do you think? Is it carbohydrates? Is it fatty acids?
Fat.
It's fatty acids. At rest and low intense sport, you are utilizing fatty acids as a source of energy. Okay? How do we synthesize fatty acids that are in our circulation? Right now we're going to talk about it because this is very important, especially if you're getting into sports medicine. Of course, once you say muscles, oh, glycogen, they have the stored carbohydrate, they utilize it. Believe it or not, the shift, the switch into glucose during the intense exercise. At resting state or mild exercise, we're talking about fatty acids. They're the main source of energy for muscles. Okay, so how do we synthesize fatty acids? Do you have fatty acids in your circulation? The answer is yes, we have it. It's being synthesized by mostly which? Liver, by the liver. But who utilizes it most is the muscles. That's one thing. Your heart. Main source for heart is what? Ketone bodies. Believe it or not. And we know that the ketone bodies, are you making ketone bodies while you're sitting right now?
Yes.
Yes. But the nervous system, the blood, the brain utilizes ketone bodies during starvation. Why? I mean, it utilizes glucose from gluconeogenesis, but why is it that it can utilize ketone bodies but not fatty acids? They don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So we convert the acetyl-CoA coming from oxidation of fatty acids into ketone bodies. We synthesize them so that they could cross the blood-brain barrier to provide the energy energy source for the brain. But also the RBCs and the heart utilize ketone bodies. So we're going to talk about anabolism in general. And with this lecture, you can connect it to any tissue. And as I indicated, for instance, athletes. Of course, when you're talking about if someone is doing, for instance, 100 yards race versus marathon, how can you train your body on certain anaerobic or aerobic? Would you go for marathon for anaerobic or aerobic training? Anaerobic. Why? Because with aerobics, what do you end up with? Lactate. What does lactate do? Cramps, pain, and so on. So you would try to train your body in terms of anaerobic metabolism. That's why they call it anaerobic training if you want to lose weight. 1. 2. Also, we'll discuss the role of certain vitamins especially vitamin B5, and how I can, for athletes, they can take that supplement and he could really train for anaerobic as well. Why is that? So we can fit it into any setting you would like, because many people say, well, this is biochemistry, what has this got to do? As I said, it will help you at least understand some of the sports medicine, and of course, sports, we're talking about muscles. I'm not going to discuss gluconeogenesis. I'm not going to discuss glycogen synthesis, but these are anabolic processes. We're going to focus on fatty acids, in particular NADPH. And we'll talk about the G6PDH deficiency. And this is very common. We're talking about really large number of people have G6PDH deficiency, and even though it causes hemolytic anemia, but it affects the body completely. And so this is why we're going to discuss today biochemical synthesis, focus on the key reductive biosynthetic molecule called NADPH, which is different than NADH, as you will see. These are the objectives. I don't have time, so I'm going to skip it. I'll let you read it. It's summary, trying to put together multiple lectures. As I said, all the slides I'm using, I already used during MOL courses. All what I'm trying to do is to describe to you anabolism. Of course, this is different than catabolism, opposite of catabolism. So anabolic processes, we call them biosynthetic processes. And as I indicated to you, muscles require fatty acid. They have to be synthesized mostly. So how does this happen? So we are building larger molecules from amino acids for proteins. We know amino acids. Can we store amino acids? We can't. We can utilize it to synthesize tissues, but we don't store it. But believe it or not, during fasting, prolonged fasting,
We break down the amino acids.
what do?
We break down the muscles.
We start gluconeogenesis. We start breaking down the the proteins, and mostly it is
Amino acids.
the muscles that we start breaking down the tissues that we have extra or excess. All let's break it down, and you'll see that after 4 hours of fasting, that the urea, the end product of amino acids, starts to go up, stays for 1 day, 2 days, and then start to go down, which means now they're shifting away from amino acids into
Lipid.
ketones. Why? Because
we want to stop breaking down the protein.
we want to stop breaking down the
protein.
proteins. So we have the glycogen. Glycogen synthesis is also another anabolic process. We're replenishing glycogen. Why do you think it is recommended that you exercise 1 day, you take a break the next day, and then you exercise intermittent exercise? You're allowing your body to replenish glycogen. As I said, you're resting, low to mild exercise, you're utilizing fatty acids. But with high intensity exercise, you start switching to glucose, and the muscles have plenty of glycogen. Does it provide that glycogen, the muscles, to the
No.
other tissues?
No, it doesn't.
No. Why? Because they're lacking the
It's a-
glucose 6 phosphatase. So it cannot release the glucose into circulation. Okay? Of course, we have other molecules that we could synthesize, the hormones, the vitamins. This is general description of anabolism. Now, we need to differentiate between NADH and NADPH. What's the difference? NADH, primary reducing power for degradative reactions. When you're trying, basically, it is utilized mostly in catabolism. Whereas NADPH, it is the reductive biosynthetic molecule. This is what we utilize for synthesis, for anabolism, to produce ATP. One thing about the ATP is produced mostly through these degradative reactions. So, amino acids, we know that they're precursors for many biomolecules, including proteins, purines, pyrimidines, histamine, nicotinamide, and also for porphyrins, for hemoglobin synthesis. We have non-essential, essential, non-essential. We can simply build them. This is what we call it when you synthesize amino acids. Anabolism, catabolism,
Do you know?
anabolism, right? You're synthesizing something from something else, from other precursors. The essential amino acids, this is why people have to take it. That's why you have to make sure that you have good diet providing the essential amino acids, because they have to take it in diet. And athletes, they're always taking supplements for their bodybuilding and their activities by taking essential amino acids. Vitamins, can we synthesize vitamins?
No, not
Small number of them, mostly they're provided
through
through the diet, small quantities, and they get utilized over and over and over. The problem with vitamins, yes, deficiencies could cause diseases,
But excessive can cause
but excessive
toxicity.
could actually fire back on you. And I'll give you one example. I'm not going to talk about many examples. I'll just talk about one example. So the fatty acids, similarly, we have essential, non-essential. Essential, we have to take in diet. Non-essential, we can synthesize them. Essential, we have the omega-6 and omega-3. You have always to make sure that you give the omega-6 and omega-3 supplements. Why? Because our bodies lack the enzymes to synthesize basically these essential amino acids before the 9th carbon from the methyl end, or the omega end. So we have omega-3, omega-6, because this is before the 9th methyl group. This is before the 9th carbon from the methyl end. So this is an fatty acids. We have the omega carbon, which is the methyl end, and we have the carboxyl end, and this is the alpha end. We have saturated, unsaturated. This is very important because, as I said, the athletes do look into these key things in terms of metabolism, and we'll talk about why. So we have the saturated fatty acid. There's no carbon, double bonds. Unsaturated, this is unsaturated, where we have at least one carbon double bond. We have monounsaturated, and we have polyunsaturated. And of course, I'm not going to discuss the olive oil. What is the olive oil? Mono, poly, saturated. Olive oil, they always say it's healthy.
It's unsaturated. Saturated.
Is it mono or poly? It's polyunsaturated. Why is it healthy? That's a different story. But also, just for health issues, you're looking into cis versus trans. You always see these chips, zero trans fat. Always think of saturated as linear, stacking up on top of each other's, and that's solid fat. And that's what causes, they say, atherosclerosis. Okay? So the trans is basically where you find the hydrogen molecules opposite to each other's. So this is the trans form, and it's almost linear. Whereas the cis form, you see bending, so it's liquid. Oil, they have the cis form. So these are bad. That's why you see these chips, bags of, they say 0% trans fat. At least now we understand why it's so. How do we synthesize fatty acids? Using fatty acid synthase. And the process basically involves 4 steps. This is the same slide I used in MOL. Condensation, reduction, dehydration, reduction. And the first step is basically to the activation or production of malonate to malonyl-CoA. So the acetate is basically activated by conversion into malonyl-CoA, and we'll see why. All what we're doing, we're synthesizing fatty acids. So we're adding acetyl or acetate group to extend the fatty acids. So the first step is the synthesis of malonyl-CoA, and this is the committed step in the fatty acid synthesis. This is what key regulatory mechanism of fatty acid synthesis, and the reaction is catalyzed by acetyl-CoA carboxylase, where it converts or activates the acetyl-CoA. We have with the CO2 as bicarb, acetyl-CoA carbonate, we have malonyl-CoA. I don't have to ask, I'm not going to ask you about the structures and so on. Just want to know that acetyl-CoA gets converted into malonyl-CoA. That's the activated acetyl-CoA. Now the fatty acid synthase is composed of 7 key enzymes. I want you to know 2 of these. The first one is the acyl carrier protein. This is the ACP, acyl carrier protein. And it has the phosphopantethane, which includes the pantothenic acid. What's the pantothenic acid? It's vitamin B5. So when you're taking too much of vitamin B5, what do you think is going to happen to the fatty acid synthase?
Increase.
It's going to increase. So what happens to your fatty acid synthesis?
Increase.
Can we convert? I mean, why is it that when we eat carb or protein, we still gain weight?
Because excess.
It can be converted to what?
Fat.
Fatty acids and triglyceride. Right? So if you're inducing too much of fatty acid synthase, what happens to triglyceride? I mean, if you're not exercising, not losing that weight, what happens is that you're going to be gaining weight. So that's why you have to balance your vitamins. And this is actually the advice for pregnant women. For instance, would you advise them vitamin supplements, or you won't advise them vitamin supplements? American school, folic acid, that's it. Other schools, European, they say give the vitamins. The problem is that if you take too much of anything, it's bad for you. So the pantothenic acid is basically vitamin B5, which is a component of the coenzyme CoA and acyl carrier protein. And the acyl carrier protein, notice here we have the thioester linkages occurring at the SH group. And all what it is, the malonyl, activated malonyl-CoA that I just showed you, would bind to this SH group by esterification. So this one I want you to know, and then I want you to know the ketoacyl ACP synthase KS. Why? I'm not going to get into the details of the synthesis, at least understand the process. I will not ask you what happens, malonyl-CoA will bind to the ACP, and then this will, growing fatty acid will attach to the KS and so on. We're not. This is just quick description so that you understand how fatty acid synthesis, but also I want to focus on key molecule here, NADPH, and how deficiency of NADPH could affect your whole body. That includes the muscles and bones and so on. Why? Because it's a key reductive biosynthetic molecule that's involved in anabolism. And I'm sure you're always confused between NADH and NADPH. At least now you know what's the difference between the two. So we have the fatty acid synthase, 2 arms, ACP and the KS, ketoacyl synthase. Notice here that the malonyl-CoA binds through this SH moiety to the ACP. The first acetyl group would bind to the KS, the ketoacyl ACP synthase. Now the first step, condensation. Notice here that we lose the CO2 and we have the acetyl-CoA group moving and forming a bond with the malonyl group. The second step And this is what I want to focus on. NADPH is needed. All what happens here, notice we have reduction, and this is done by NADPH. Is it oxidized or reduced form? Reduced form. Right? NADPH is reduced form. So we have reduction, and you can see here that we have reduction of the double bonds with the oxygen. Now it's becoming OH. Dehydration, loss of water, and then finally we have reduction, and we have another NADPH. This is what I'm trying to focus on. I'm not trying to focus on the whole process. You don't need to know all this. Just know the importance of NADPH, that it is needed for fatty acid synthesis. And as indicated, you're using fatty acids right now in your muscles and so on for energy production. And this whole process would continue, meaning another malonyl-CoA would come and bind to the ACP through the SH, and this whole cycle continues over and over. And all what we're doing, we're extending the length of the chain by 2 carbon molecules, because that's the acetate being added. When we go for the catabolic process where we have beta oxidation, we're releasing acetyl-CoA every cycle of beta oxidation. So what happens after that? We have, after it reaches the 16 carbon saturated, that's when it's broken from ACP. And this is by thioesterase. Breaks it down. Fatty acid synthase cannot synthesize beyond the 16 carbon molecule. Then we have elongase. And we have multiple elongases. These are the fatty acid elongases, or what we call elongation of very long chain fatty acids, LOVL. And basically they would go beyond the C16. Now, what are the most common fatty acids in humans? Odd or even? Even. Mostly even. Only few odd number fatty acids. Now, what happens about the double bonds? We have another enzyme, steroid-CoA desaturase, that causes formation of double bonds. That's all what I care about. That after it's being synthesized by the fatty acid, we have another enzyme called steroid. We have different ones, of course, not only the steroid, called desaturase, but we have other desaturase enzymes that will form the double bond. Talking about this enzyme, this is interesting. Do you know Wagyu meat? The Wagyu meat, right? Come on, if you go to the market and you see these slices of steak that are around 250 reals per piece, right? Wagyu. The Japanese cow. Don't believe what they say. Oh, they put them on music and all this nonsense. Here's the story with them, actually. This is of interest. Why is it the Wagyu is mostly in Japan? Is the Wagyu in US is the same as the Wagyu in Japan? What's the story? Second World War II, the Americans took 4 bulls from the Wagyu Japanese cows, and they took them to US. But they were male, but they had to mix them with the female. That's the Wagyu from US. There are 2 farms in US that can produce the Wagyu. Is less marbling, less fat. Why? Because the Wagyu cows have mutations in the desaturase. That's why you have high fat content. As a matter of fact, if you're eating the Wagyu meat, the Japanese, you're eating almost like butter. Too much fat, too much marbling. So in US, it's actually tastes better in terms of the steak. So is it healthy or unhealthy? Now maybe the Japanese are arguing, oh, this is the healthy one, even though it's saturated. We know that saturated fat is bad for you. But anyway, I just thought this is interesting because it's a mutation. So if anyone wants to be really rich, could steal one of these bulls from Japan and start mixing it. But you know, it's under actually protection. There's no way you can take that cow out of Japan. Or you can make it genetically modified, right? Cause the mutation of the desaturase. Anyway, back to our ketone bodies. What are the ketone bodies? Ketogenesis, right? So we have the acetone, acetoacetate, and beta hydroxybutyrate. Every time we say ketone bodies, you're thinking of diabetes, ketoacidosis.
Yes.
But as a matter of fact, it's a source for fuel for heart and muscle as well. So you do utilize ketone bodies. And as I said, now you are producing ketone bodies, but at a low rate. Especially the heart utilizes the ketone bodies as an energy source. And we talked about ketone bodies, and especially their main source, energy source for brain during starvation. What happens during starvation? I showed you the slide before, where we have fatty acids. They release acetyl-CoA during starvation, right? And then they go to the TCA cycle to produce energy. But the oxaloacetate, we said, during starvation, what happens? We need to produce glucose, gluconeogenesis. So oxaloacetate is being driven to synthesize the glucose. So this affects the TCA cycle, slows it down. As a matter of fact, what happens because of that? Acetyl-CoA is increased. So now the acetyl-CoA gets converted into ketone bodies, as simple as this. Low oxaloacetate, because it's being diverted for gluconeogenesis. Slowdown of TCA, accumulation of acetyl-CoA, now ketone bodies are formed. So ketone bodies are formed from which intermediates? Acetyl-CoA. So for the synthesis of acetyl-CoA, for the synthesis of ketone bodies, we need acetyl-CoA. Now, you'll see that acetoacetate is formed first. Spontaneous decarboxylation results in acetone. I'm not going to ask about the structure, just know the names. Acetone, acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate. These are the ketone bodies. We have acetone. This is why diabetic patients, if they have ketoacidosis, the smell of acetone in their breath. And then we have the other enzyme, hydroxybutyrate dehydrogenase, converting acetoacetate to hydroxybutyrate. What's the main one? Hydroxybutyrate. As a matter of fact, the levels are 3 to 10 times higher in diabetic patients during ketoacidosis. Why am I saying this? These are common questions. I've seen it all the time. But also, as I said, these are sources of energy for the muscles and the heart and so on. And the heart is a muscle after all. What is the synthesis? All what I want you to know from this slide is that acetyl-CoA basically is condensed to form acetoacetate. One. So the precursors are acetyl-CoA. Another thing I want you to know, we have HMG-CoA. We have two enzymes. One responsible for cholesterol, and this is HMG-CoA reductase. And the inhibitors of this one is statins, right? And then we have HMG-CoA lyase. And the lyase is responsible for acetoacetate synthesis. That's all what I care from this slide. Okay? So, cholesterol. Let's talk about anabolism in general and how we can, of course, all what we're talking about here, anabolism, also to serve the muscles, to serve the key components of the musculoskeletal system. So the cholesterol, can statin affect cholesterol synthesis? Yes, should lower it. Can we lower cholesterol by eating less
Not very
diet
much.
containing cholesterol?
Not very because
No. Why? Because 80% is synthesized in the liver, 10% is in the intestine, and 5% in the skin. 5% come from
food.
the diet. Simple. This is also cholesterol is synthesized from condensation of acetyl-CoA. And we have, this is the same pathway which we talked about, the ketone body ketogenesis. The only difference here, we said what? We have HMG-CoA reductase, not HMG-CoA ligase. That's all what I care about. I'm not going to ask you about the pathways, just know the process. So in addition, cholesterol can be utilized for bile acid synthesis. I understand saying this is musculoskeletal. As I said, you cannot. This is, you have to put all the systems. Everything is all linked together. So cholesterol can be utilized for bile acid synthesis, and we do have the cholic acid, chenodeoxycholic acid. If you want to make them better emulsifiers for lipid absorption, then they make the salts by basically linking them to amide bonds with glycine or with taurine. So we have glycolate and taurocholate. I can summarize all these slides, as I said, in 2-3 slides. Just understand, everything you see I use for my classes for mode. Nothing else. I did not add anything else. This is cholesterol, so we can use the cholesterol for steroid synthesis. So we know that steroid also affects the muscles, right? They're abusing the steroids for synthesis, so anabolic. So I also can talk about insulin and how insulin is an anabolic hormone that athletes abuse for basically for muscle building because it's an anabolic hormone. I mean, I can talk about so many things that are involved in terms of anabolism and how it affects the muscles. But also, these are different steroids. I showed you the slide. And this steroid, cholesterol, is being used for aldosterone, cortisol, and then we have the major gonadal estrogens, estrogens, and testosterone. Estrogens is where do we find it? Estrogens in mammary tissues and breast tissues. That's why when males have enlarged breasts, because of the fact there's more estrogen being synthesized by fat that they gain. As simple as this. I'm not going to talk about this pathway. It's just to show you that it is cholesterol is precursor for steroids as well. And we synthesize cholesterol as well. So it's an anabolic process because mostly it's synthesized in the body. Now let's talk about key pathway that generates the NADPH. And we talked about the significance of NADPH. Reductive synthetic power comes from NADPH. How do we synthesize the NADPH? The pentose phosphate pathway. So we have glucose 6-phosphate that can be utilized for glycolysis, we know that. But also glucose 6-phosphate can be converted into pentose sugar, but also it produces NADPH, and the enzyme involved with this is the G6PDH, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. And we have major issue with the G6PDH because it's involved in many conditions, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But you can see that glucose 6-phosphate is being converted into 6-phosphogluconolactone, pentose. So the end product of the oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate pathway results in the production of oxidative phase NADPH. Non-oxidative phase will produce the pentose. So this is just the pentose phosphate pathway. All what I just want you to know is basically this is a summary. This is what I care about. Don't worry about this. All what it is, we're producing NADPH. That's the key issue. But also, if you notice, we talked about free radicals. You recall free radicals and so on, and how it affects it, and why we're taking antioxidants and so on, because we want to protect our cells from damage, from oxidative stress. So what happens? We have oxygen, we have superoxide production from oxygen. Then we have the superoxide dismutase converting the superoxide to hydrogen peroxide. And then hydrogen peroxide is converted to hydroxyl free radical that could damage everything basically. Proteins, lipids, could affect all organs, all tissues, the free radicals. So this is why people are taking reduced glutathione. Reduced glutathione because of the fact that the reduced glutathione converts the hydrogen peroxide into water. And then we have the oxidized glutathione. So if you look into the athletes or people who are trying to protect themselves, anti-aging, they're taking reduced glutathione. So what happens? We have glutathione peroxidase with the reduced glutathione converting hydrogen peroxide. We're protecting ourselves, antioxidant, and so on. But also, notice here that the oxidized glutathione requires the NADPH. So not only the NADPH, productive synthetic power, but also protective power for our tissues and our organs. So we have glutathione reductase that converts basically the oxidized glutathione to reduced glutathione, requires NADPH. Where does it come from? The pentose phosphate pathway. So glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency. Most people with G6PD-H deficiency are asymptomatic. Combination with certain environmental factors such as the sulfa antibiotics, herbicides, anti-malarials, and basically fovzin. When you're eating fava beans food, some people will have hemolytic anemia as a result. This one is the most common genetic enzymopathy. We're talking about 400 million people affected worldwide. And as I said, our key molecule here is NADPH. Needed for everything, including protection of the cells. That includes the muscles, the bones, everything, because of free radical generation. So we're talking about 50% of Kurdish men affected, 10 to 14% of African American men with G6PD-H deficiency. It's a common one. It's a recessive sex-linked mutations. We have homozygous mutations, heterozygous mutations. Symptoms include black-colored urine, low RBCs, and low hemoglobin, elevated bilirubin. This is all because of hemolysis that occurs, and reticulocytosis. Primaquine, anti-malarial drug. Some people, when they take it, if they are G6PD-H deficient, it induces free radicals, and this would lead into cellular damage and hemolysis. And of course, this is because of the fact that these individuals with G6PD-H, they're lacking NADPH that will lead to production of reduced glutathione. So what do you do here in these cases?
Avoid that.
Would you suggest giving them some supplements?
Avoid that.
You avoid it, but also what about giving them some
Glutathione.
reduced glutathione, right? That could help. But also, other chemicals would increase this oxidant stress, including aspirin, NSAIDs, sulfonamides, guanidine and guanine, naphthalene, fava beans because of the vicine and isouramine. The vicine is the toxic product of the vicine. And just to let you know that fava beans now they're making it genetically modified so that they do not include the vicine and isouramine. And now there is some fava beans with this low vicine and isouramine. With that, I conclude. Do you have another lecture at 11? And I was speeding up just so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.